Closing costs. Closing costs are an assortment of fees, including fees charged by a lender, the title company, attorneys, insurance companies, tax authorities, homeowners associations, real estate agents, and other closing settlement-related companies. These closing costs are typically paid at the time of closing a real estate transaction.
So closing costs have been very different things in our real estate career. Because when we started, in the late 90s, almost a lot of buyers would just write their closing costs in and have them paid by the seller. It was almost every deal. Because you could do these 80-20 loans, people would get in for no money, the seller would pay their closing costs, and it was just cheap and you could get in a house. Now, in the market we're in, we're not seeing sellers being willing to pay closing costs. Buyers have to have their own money. They have to have down payment and all of that stuff, and the seller is not going to be kicking in as much. So it's really changed that way. Because one of the ways I know that is I've had agents ask me, well, what would you write in if we're going to want to ask for them? Like how much would you write in for closing costs? Any ideas?
As a buyer?
Well, if you're writing one for a buyer.
I would tell them to not write one in.
Yeah, but so the lender says you have to have them.
$2,000.
What do you think, Ken?
Well, it definitely depends on how the deal unravels. So
Say a number, Ken.
2,200.
Oh, the flame price is right.
Jen was looking for a number.
Yeah. So the thing is, it totally depends on the person's loan, because if they are escrowing, you have to cover the escrows, and depends on the time of year, because if it's later in the year, there needs to be more money in those escrows, and those escrows get padded. So it can really fluctuate. The best thing to do is ask the lender, what are you going to need to cover for those closing costs?
Because they'll figure your prorations too.
Yeah.
Tax prorations.
Back in the day, we would always write in like 2,500, but I just had somebody ask me a couple of days ago, and I told them to write in 3,500. But
it depends on what the taxes are too.
Yeah, it depends on the taxes in the municipality and the time of year. But figuring the time of the year was the beginning, it was like there weren't going to be that many taxes yet. But it can fluctuate, right?
Sure can.
So if you have a situation where closing costs have to be written in, how do you make it palatable for the seller?
Go ahead, Ken.
What does a seller like?
Well, the seller likes to have as much moolah as possible.
Yeah. So that's what we always used to do, is we would write in over, we would say, okay, here's what were the prices, because back in the day, you would just write asking price. I know that seems crazy now because we always go over, but you would write the asking price, and then you would take the 2,500, tack it on the top, and then that would be the price. So it was net to the seller the same amount. And that's how we got into trouble, because you could get it to appraise for whatever you wanted to back then. And so it would appraise for more than it was worth. And then people were upside down on their mortgages. Yay. So it's probably good that we're not, doing that with closing costs anyway.
Right.
Probably.
What's your closing cost story, Matt?
I think it's the 80-20 stuff, but it's been such a long time since we had to do those.
Yeah, because, really, there used to be financing that was like BC financing, and you could have a 490 credit score, and you were able to
If you had a pulse.
If you had a pulse, the lender would say, okay, I need you to get $10,000 in closing costs paid by the seller. The lender would take a huge cut of that, and they would, get somebody to do the loan. But then you'd already be underwater because you paid.
But you had nice furniture.
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't sound legal.
The good old days.
The good old days.
The good old days. So, but nowadays we just write in closing costs and we try and get them as close to what they can be. And for some people, I mean, I've seen a few times that those closing costs will get through. So
How often do you think buyers are writing in closing costs, and how often are sellers accepting that in today's market in 2021 and 2020? I mean, because
I think a
haven't
lot of
heard it.
times you have to bump the price to cover the
yeah, you have
costs.
to you have to bump the price. You have to have a seller that's very eager or not selling or something like that. So, I mean, if you had 100 offers, maybe 2 have closing costs paid.
So
I
if
would
you
say.
put in an offer for like 30 grand over asking, and you ask for closing costs to be covered as the buyer, seller should be able to do that, right? I mean, if it's near the beginning of the year, it's like 3
It's minimal,
grand.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
wouldn't you
it
think
all turns
you
out to be
just-
what the net is, but it doesn't make sense from a negotiating standpoint
yeah.
because then it looks like, well, you're paying me all this extra money, but you don't have enough money for your closing costs.
Right,
Yeah. So it's all kind of semantics.
right. That makes sense.
If you like content like this, consider watching some of these other videos, hitting the subscribe button. If you want to know what your house is currently worth, go to hometeamforyou.com and look at the free evaluation tool.